Action Park might be the wildest and most bizarre place you'll ever hear about. All the stories covered in this video are taken from actual people working or visiting the park. This is the original map of the whole park. Throughout the video, we'll be visiting each location and going over the almost too good to be true stories from those locations. But first, let's go back to the beginning.
There's nothing in the world like Action Park.
Action Park was an amusement and water park located in New Jersey, on the grounds of the Vernon Valley Ski Resort. The park consisted primarily of water-based attractions, and originally opened to the public in 1978 under the ownership of Great American Recreation. This park featured 3 separate attraction areas: the Alpine Center, Motor World, and Water World. The latter was one of the first modern American water parks. Many of its attractions were unique, so naturally it attracted thrill seekers. While extremely popular, Action Park had a reputation for poorly designed rides, undertrained and underaged staff, intoxicated guests, including staff, and a consequently poor safety record. At least 6 people are known to have died as a result of mishaps on rides at the park. Healthcare workers and local residents had nicknamed the place Traction Park, Accident Park, Class Action Park, and Friction Park. Little effort was made by state regulators to address those issues, despite the park's history of repeat violations. Let's go back to 1978 when it all started. The park got more water slides and a small deep-water swimming pool, as well as tennis courts and a softball field, were added to what became known as the Water World section of Action Park. Quote, "Gene didn't want to do the same old shit where you just get strapped into something or it twirls around." Andy Mulvihill, later the park's head lifeguard, recalls his father's philosophy in creating Action Park. He wanted to take the idea of skiing, which is exhilarating because you control the action, and transfer it to an amusement park. There's inherent risk in that, but that's what makes it fun. That's what makes it fun. Yup. With that being said, let's first start off with the Water World. Water-based attractions made up half of the park's rides and accounted for the greatest share of its casualty count. Mountain Creek Water Park and its currently revived Action Park still operate some of these attractions. It also had a miniature golf course and standard pools and rides for children. These were sometimes smaller, safer versions of the park's main attractions. In 1983, they built an enclosed water slide called the Cannonball Loop. This was not unusual for that time. In fact, the park already had several such slides. On this one, however, they decided to build a complete vertical loop at the end, similar to that of a roller coaster. The resulting slide was so intimidating that employees have reported they were offered $100 to test it. Fergus, who described himself as one of the idiots who took the offer, said, "100 did not buy enough boozy to drown out that memory." The slide was open for only a month before it was closed at the order of the state's advisory board, a highly unusual move at the time. One worker told a local newspaper that there were too many bloody noses and back injuries from riders. Some early riders came back with lacerations to their bodies. When the ride was closed to determine what had caused them, teeth that had fallen out were found lodged in the interior walls. A former Navy physician found that riders were experiencing as much as 9 Gs of acceleration as they went through the loop. A story widely reported was that some of the test dummies sent down before it opened had been dismembered and decapitated. The founder's son, Andy, was the first live person to test the ride afterwards, which he did wearing his full set of ice hockey protective equipment. "The Cannonball Loop was not fun," he recalled later. "It was more like a ride you ride to survive than to have fun." A rider also reportedly got stuck at the top of the loop due to insufficient water pressure, and a hatch had to be installed at the bottom of the slope to allow for future extractions. Those who rode the Cannonball Loop have said that more safety measures were taken than was otherwise common at the park. Riders were weighed, hosed down with cold water, instructed to remove jewelry, and then carefully instructed in how they had to position their bodies to complete the ride. The ride reopened a few more times over the years. In the summers of 1995 and 1996, it was opened for several days before further injuries forced its permanent shutdown. For the remainder of the park's existence, Cannonball Loop remained visible near the entrance of Water World. It was dismantled shortly after the park closed. The Alpine Slide. Action Park's 820-meter Alpine Slide descended the mountain beneath one of the ski area's chairlifts, which provided guests access to the top of the slide. Riders sat on small sleds that had only a control stick and rode down the slide in long chutes built into the slope. The ride, and more specifically the sleds, of course, became notorious for causing injuries. The stick that was supposed to control the sled's speed in practice offered just two options on the infrequently maintained vehicles: extremely slow and a speed described by one former employee as death awaits. The chutes in which the sleds traveled were made of concrete, fiberglass, and asbestos, which led to serious abrasions on riders who took even mild falls. The tendency of guests to ride in bathing suits made the problem worse. The path underneath the chairlift resulted in verbal harassment and spitting from passengers going up for their turn. Guests riding the lift would also often knock the sleds off, slowing down operations as employees had to run down and retrieve them. The slide was the site of the first fatality at the park in 1980. 19-year-old George Larson Jr., who had previously been a ski lift operator at Vernon Valley, was thrown from the slide when his car jumped the track and his head struck a rock. After several days in a coma, he died. Action Park said that Larson was an employee. It was nighttime and also raining when the accident happened. They also said that, as an employee, his death did not need to be reported to state regulators. Had state inspectors looked at the site, they would have seen that rocks were still there, which they had told the park to remove on an earlier visit. Hay bales at the curves were put in place in an attempt to cushion the impact of guests whose sleds jumped the track, a frequent occurrence. While park officials regularly asserted its safety, the slide was responsible for the bulk of the accidents, injuries, lawsuits, and state citations for safety violations in the early years of the park. According to state records, the Alpine slide produced 14 fractures and 26 head injuries. The Bailey Ball. The Bailey Ball was an Alpine Center attraction developed and tested, but thankfully never opened to the public as a result of testing it. It consisted of a large steel sphere in which a rider could be secured and then rolled downward. The plan was to do it on a track with PVC pipe as its outer rails. The designers neglected to take into account the tendency of PVC pipe to expand in heat. During the first test, with a state inspector present on a hot summer day, the ball, with a man inside testing it, went off the track as a result of the pipe expanding and bounded down the adjacent ski slope. It continued through the parking lot, across Route 94, and came to rest in a swamp. After it came to a natural stop at the bottom, the inspector left without saying anything, and park management abandoned the project. The Motor World. Action Park's Motor World section consisted of rides based around powered vehicles and boats on the west side of Route 94, opposite the main part of the park. The Super Go-Karts allowed guests to drive around a small loop track at a speed around 20 miles per hour, controlled by the governor devices on the carts. However, park employees knew how to circumvent the governors by wedging tennis balls into them, and they were known to do so for guests. As a result, an otherwise standard small-engine kart ride became an opportunity to play bumper cars at 50 miles per hour, and many injuries resulted from head-on collisions. Also, the kart's engines were poorly maintained, and some riders were overcome by gasoline fumes as they drove. The Lola cars were miniature open-cockpit race cars on a longer track. Extra money was charged to drive them, and they too could be adjusted for speed by park employees. Former employees have said that after park management briefly set up a microbrewery nearby, employees would break into the brewery, steal the beer, and then take the cars out and ride them on Route 94. Battle Action Tanks was one of the most popular rides in Motor World, and it was featured prominently in television ads. For an additional fee, guests could enter a chain-link fence-enclosed area and operate small tanks for 5 minutes at a time. The tanks were equipped with tennis ball cannons that enabled riders to shoot at a sensor prominently mounted on each tank. If hit, the tank stopped operating for 15 seconds, while other guests often took advantage of the delay to hit the disabled vehicle with more fire. Visitors on the outside could also use less costly cannons mounted on the perimeter fence. When workers had to enter the cage to attend to a stuck or crashed tank, which often happened several times a day, they were commonly pelted with tennis balls, despite prohibitions against such behavior. One guest poured freaking lighter fluid on a tennis ball and ignited it before firing. This gave the ride a reputation for being more dangerous for the employees than the guests, making it one of the least popular places to work in the park. The super speedboats were set up in a small pond, known by park staff to be heavily infested with snakes. They could be driven around a small island at 40 miles per hour. Like the land vehicles, many riders ended up using them to play bumper boats, and one seriously inebriated rider had to be rescued by the attendant lifeguard after his boat capsized into the snake-infested water following a collision. On the Aqua Scoot, riders would carry a hard, solid plastic sled up to the top of the ride, go down a slide consisting of rollers akin to those found in factories like assembly lines, and end up in a pool that in most areas was no deeper than a puddle. The idea of the ride was, once the sled hit the water, to skip across the water like a stone. To do this, the rider had to be in a certain position, leaned back. If the rider was not in this position, the sled would sink into the water as soon as it hit the pool, flinging the rider off head first, which often resulted in head injuries. Conversely, a rider who leaned back in 1995 overdid it and suffered serious head injuries falling off the back of the sled. Other times, riders would be leaving the pool only to have others crash into them as they were riding. This ride consisted of parallel slides originally. At some point in the mid-1980s, a third slide was added. However, the slides were removed when Intrawest took over the resort in 1998. The Tarzan swing was a steel arch hanging from a 20-foot-long cable over a spring-fed pool. Patrons waited in long lines for the chance to hang from it, swing out over the water, then jump off as the beam reached its height. In the park's early years, the area patrons jumped from was not over the water, but a cushioned area. Some people who let go as soon as they started their swing would land on the cushion and then slide crash into the water. In the mid-1980s, the starting position was shifted so that patrons started over the water. Some patrons hung on too long and scraped their toes on the concrete at the far side. Others used the ride properly, but were then surprised to find out the water underneath was very cold. It was so cold, in fact, that the lifeguards sometimes had to rescue people who were so surprised by the sudden chill that they could not swim out of the pool. The surf hill allowed patrons to slide down a water-slick sloped surface on mats into small puddles until they reached a foam barrier after an upslope at the end. Barriers between lanes were minimal, and people frequently collided with each other on the way down or at the end. The seventh lane was known as the backbreaker, due to its special kicker 2/3 of the way down intended to allow jumps and splashdowns into a larger puddle. Employees at the park used to like eating at a nearby snack bar with a good view of the attraction, since it was almost guaranteed that they could see some serious injuries, lost bikini tops, or both. In fact, the founder had built viewing space for this specific purpose shortly after opening the ride. Super speed water slides, also known as Geronimo Falls, were two slides set slightly apart from the rest of the park and took advantage of nearly vertical slopes to allow riders to attain higher speeds than usually possible. One started with riders going almost vertically downwards and was covered with screening for the first several feet. As barriers on the side of the slides were very low, lifeguards reminded every user to remain flat on their backs with their arms at their sides as they descended, since it would not be possible to ride it otherwise and stay on. The Aerodium. The Aerodium is a skydiving simulator wind tunnel invented in Germany in 1984. In 1987, Action Park built and opened its own Aerodium in the Waterworld section of the park, becoming the first American amusement park to open one. Stadium seating encircled the perimeter of the Aerodium, allowing friends and spectators to watch riders fly. Riders wearing a special skydiving suit, helmet, and earplugs would join the body flight instructor one by one on a trampoline-like netting directly over the fan. The instructor would grab each rider's wrists and guide the rider to fall forward, allowing the fan to lift the rider skyward. After a few seconds of flight, the attendant operating the fan would cut the power, causing the rider to fall onto the air cushions surrounding the fan. As you might have guessed, this caused severe injuries, for example, when a rider instinctively tried to break his fall by extending his arm, which caused shoulder dislocation, severed nerves, and near-permanent paralysis of the arm. That's all for this video. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Hello? Why are you still here? Click the video already.